The English monarchy is often presented as one of the oldest and most stable institutions in the world, a continuous line of kings and queens stretching calmly across 1,000 years. That image is reassuring, but it is also misleading. In reality, the English crown has been one of the most contested political institutions in human history. It has been conquered by foreigners, seized by rivals, limited by law, abolished by revolution, restored by compromise, and gradually transformed from a source of raw power into a symbol of national continuity. What survived for a millennium was not royal authority in its original form, but a monarchy capable of adapting to pressure. The history of English monarchy is therefore not a story of uninterrupted rule, but of survival through change. That story begins in 1066, the most famous date in English history. When William the Conqueror defeated King Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings, he did far more than replace one ruler with another. He ended the Anglo-Saxon system of kingship entirely. William did not rule by election or tradition, he ruled by conquest. England became his personal possession, claimed by the sword. All land was declared the king's property and redistributed to Norman followers who owed him military service. The Old English elite was almost completely removed, replaced by a foreign aristocracy that spoke French and governed through castles, mounted knights, and fear. England was no longer ruled by an English king, it was occupied by a Norman one. Yet even William quickly learned that conquest alone could not sustain a kingdom. The Norman ruling class was small, numbering only a few thousand, and could not administer a country of millions without cooperation. English laws, courts, and local customs survived because they were necessary. William swore at his coronation to uphold the laws of Edward the Confessor, acknowledging that even a conqueror needed legitimacy. From the very start of Norman rule, English monarchy existed in tension between domination and consent, between force and law. That tension would shape the next 1,000 years. After William's death, his empire fractured as his sons fought one another for control. Kingship passed not through orderly succession, but through rivalry, betrayal, and violence. Royal authority appeared fragile, dependent on military strength and political alliances rather than sacred inheritance. Stability returned only under Henry I, a ruler who understood that power needed structure. Henry strengthened royal justice, formalized taxation, and created administrative systems such as the Exchequer to monitor income and expenditure. For the first time, England began to function as a centralized state rather than a personal domain. Prosperity followed, not because Henry ruled gently, but because he ruled predictably. That stability collapsed suddenly in 1120 with the White Ship disaster. Henry's only legitimate son drowned after a drunken voyage, wiping out the line of succession in a single night. Henry forced his nobles to swear loyalty to his daughter Matilda, but when he died in 1135, those oaths proved worthless. England descended into nearly 2 decades of civil war between King Stephen and Empress Matilda. Law disintegrated, castles spread across the countryside, and private warfare became the norm. Chroniclers described the era as one in which Christ and his saints slept, capturing the sense of a kingdom without effective authority. The Civil War revealed a harsh truth. Bloodline alone could not secure the English crown. A ruler needed acceptance. That acceptance returned only when Matilda's son became king as Henry II. Henry rebuilt England with astonishing speed and energy. More than any previous ruler, he transformed monarchy into an institution of law. Royal courts expanded across the country, legal procedures were standardized, and the early foundations of trial by jury emerged. Justice was no longer simply personal or local. It flowed from the crown. England was becoming a kingdom governed by law, rather than ruled solely by force. Yet Henry's reign also exposed new limits to royal authority. His bitter conflict with Thomas Becket ended in disaster when Becket was murdered inside Canterbury Cathedral by knights who believed they were acting in the king's interests. The public outrage was overwhelming. Becket became a martyr, Henry was forced into public penance, and the idea that a king was morally accountable took deep root. Kingship survived, but its claim to absolute authority was permanently weakened. The crown could rule, but it could not ignore conscience, religion, or public opinion. Henry's son, Richard the Lionheart, embodied a very different model of monarchy. Richard was a warrior king, a crusader, and a living symbol of chivalry. Yet he spent barely 6 months of his 10-year reign in England. The kingdom existed largely to fund his wars abroad. Taxes rose, offices were sold, and governance was delegated to officials. Richard became legendary, but his rule drained England's resources and left domestic stability fragile. When he died without an heir, the crown passed to his brother John, a ruler whose failures would permanently alter the relationship between king and kingdom. King John lost England's French territories, alienated the church, and ruled through extortion and fear. His financial demands on the nobility became unbearable. Rebellion was inevitable. In 1215, John was forced to seal Magna Carta, a document that asserted a revolutionary principle. The king himself was subject to the law. Although Magna Carta was designed to protect elite interest rather than ordinary people, its symbolic significance was enormous. It established that law stood above the crown, a concept that would echo through centuries. John immediately tried to undo the agreement, plunging England into civil war once again. French forces invaded, and the monarchy teetered on the edge of collapse. John's death in 1216 saved the crown only because compromise followed. His young son, Henry III, ruled under regents who reissued Magna Carta and restored order. Over time, however, resentment returned as royal favoritism and foreign influence dominated the court. Rebellion erupted again under Simon de Montfort, who briefly took control of the kingdom. In 1265, de Montfort summoned a parliament that included not only nobles and bishops, but representatives from towns and counties. Though de Montfort was defeated and killed, the idea of representative government survived him. By the reign of Edward I, England had become a more coherent nation-state. Edward strengthened the legal system, conquered Wales, and attempted to dominate Scotland. Crucially, he relied on Parliament to raise taxes for war, embedding it permanently in governance. Royal authority remained formidable, but it was now conditional. Kings could no longer rule effectively without negotiation and consent. The crown was powerful, but it was no longer absolute. That reality became unavoidable when kings failed. Edward II's military incompetence, favoritism, and personal scandals led to his deposition. He was removed not by foreign invasion, but by his own political community, demonstrating that an English king could be overthrown. The crown survived, but its vulnerability was now undeniable. Subsequent rulers faced unprecedented challenges. The Black Death devastated the population, killing perhaps half of England's people. Labour became scarce, wages rose, and traditional feudal relationships weakened. Society began to push back against authority in ways kings struggled to control. At the same time, prolonged warfare, particularly the 100 Years' War, transformed monarchy again. Kings such as Edward III needed vast sums of money to sustain professional armies. Parliament grew stronger as taxation expanded. Royal authority increasingly depended on cooperation rather than command. By the late medieval period, attempts to revive absolute monarchy repeatedly failed. Richard II asserted divine authority and ruled autocratically, only to be deposed by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke. The crown passed not by clear right, but by force, supported by Parliament. Civil war followed, culminating in the rise of the Tudors. Under Henry VIII, royal power surged once more. Henry broke with Rome, seized church wealth, and centralized authority to a degree unseen since the Norman conquest. For a moment, monarchy appeared absolute again. Yet this power rested on unstable foundations. Religious division, financial strain, and succession crises destabilized the realm, revealing once more that unchecked authority could not endure. The final transformation of English monarchy came in the 17th century, when conflict between Crown and Parliament erupted into civil war. Charles I insisted on ruling without consent and claimed divine authority. Parliament responded with force. In 1649, Charles was tried and executed, abolishing monarchy entirely. England became a republic, proving that kingship was not inevitable. Although the monarchy was later restored, it never regained absolute power. After the Glorious Revolution of 1688, the rules of monarchy changed permanently. Kings ruled by consent of Parliament, not by divine right. Law became supreme, and the crown became constitutional. By the modern era, the monarchy had evolved into a symbolic institution. Its authority derived not from command, but from tradition, continuity, and public acceptance. The English monarchy survived 1,000 years not because it was unchallenged, but because it learned when to yield. It adapted its role, surrendered power when necessary, and reinvented itself repeatedly in response to pressure. From conquest to contract, from command to consent, the crown endured by changing. That, more than bloodlines or crowns, is the true secret behind 1,000 years of English monarchy. 1,000 years of English monarchy wasn't held together by crowns or castles. It survived because it changed when it had to, bending before it broke, adapting when power slipped away. From conquest to compromise, from absolute rule to symbolic authority, the crown endured by learning the limits of its own power. And that lesson still shapes the world we live in today. If you enjoyed this fast-paced journey through 1,000 years of history and want more deep dives that explain how power, politics, and institutions really evolve, like and subscribe.